A billionaire stepped onto his sprawling estate one quiet afternoon, only to freeze at a sight that would change his life forever. Under the shade of an oak tree, his young son wasn't being tutored by an elite instructor or expensive mentor. Instead, a homeless boy in torn clothes sat cross-legged on the grass, patiently teaching the billionaire's heir how to solve fractions from a battered notebook. It didn't make sense. How could a child with no roof over his head, no silver spoon, no access to privilege, teach the son of one of the wealthiest men alive? And why did the billionaire's boy look more engaged, more alive, more inspired, than he ever had in his father's world of abundance? The billionaire narrowed his eyes. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? And why did his son cling to him with such admiration, as if he'd found the one teacher money could never buy? He took a step forward, his polished shoes crunching against gravel, but the boy didn't run. Instead, he lifted his head with calm, unflinching pride, eyes burning with the kind of strength only hardship can carve. In that moment, the billionaire felt something stir deep inside him. But what he discovered next would shake him more than anything his wealth or power had ever prepared him for. The boy wasn't just poor. He was an orphan, left behind by a world that didn't care if he lived or starved. Viewers, what would you do if you were that billionaire? Would you chase the boy away, or invite him in? Would you see just rags and dirt, or would you see resilience, brilliance, and a second chance staring back at you? Dad! Noah's voice carried, breaking the billionaire's thoughts. This is Jacob. He's been helping me with math. His face glowed with a joy Alexander hadn't seen in years. Alexander Whitmore, titan of industry, wasn't used to being caught off guard. He had built an empire after clawing his way out of betrayal. Once, a trusted partner had stolen millions, nearly collapsing the company his father built. Alexander had sworn then, never again would someone beneath him rise without his permission. He believed power was a fortress, wealth, his weapon. But as he stared at this ragged boy sitting on his manicured lawn, he felt that fortress tremble. Jacob closed his notebook, his voice steady. Your son's smart. He just needed someone to listen. Alexander arched a brow. And you? Who listens to you? The boy didn't flinch. No one, he admitted, a faint edge of defiance in his tone. But I don't need pity. I need purpose. It was that word, purpose, that sliced through Alexander like a blade. Years of shallow galas, empty deals, and hollow praise echoed in his mind. Purpose was the one thing his billions had never bought. Noah tugged at his sleeve. Dad, can Jacob come inside? Please. Alexander's gaze lingered on Jacob. In those unwashed clothes, in that dirt-streaked face, he saw something terrifying, a reflection of himself, decades ago, before revenge hardened his heart. And for the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore didn't know whether to feel threatened, or redeemed. Dinner was usually a lonely affair at the Whitmore estate, but that evening, the air vibrated with an unusual energy. Noah hadn't stopped chattering since they'd left the garden. He talked of fractions, stories Jacob had told, even how Jacob used sticks to draw equations in the dirt. Alexander sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his silverware gleaming, but his eyes never strayed far from the boy who now sat at the far end, shoulders squared despite wearing clothes too thin for the season. You said your name is Jacob, Alexander began, his tone even but his gaze sharp. And your family? Jacob hesitated, his fork pausing over the food the butler had reluctantly served him. For a moment, his jaw tightened, but then he forced a shrug. It's just me. Alexander leaned back, his mind filing that away. Just me. Two words that hinted at emptiness but carried the weight of resilience. He remembered another boy once, standing outside a grocery store, pockets empty after his father had lost everything in a crooked deal. That boy had been Alexander, and he had vowed that night never to depend on anyone again. Noah kicked his legs under the table, oblivious to the tension. He's really good, Dad. Better than Mrs. Carraway. She just makes me feel stupid, but Jacob, he makes me understand. Alexander's lips twitched into a humorless smile. A boy off the streets teaching better than the tutor I pay 6 figures for. That would be unusual. Jacob met his stare, unafraid. Understanding doesn't cost money, sir. It costs time. The butler coughed, shifting uncomfortably. He'd seen Alexander crush rivals for less insolence. Once, when a contractor had tried to cut corners on a skyscraper project, Alexander hadn't simply fired him, he'd orchestrated a public humiliation so severe the man fled the industry altogether. That was Alexander Whitmore. Betrayal meant brutal retribution. Compassion had no place in his empire. And yet, here was a child daring to speak of things money couldn't buy. After dinner, as Noah bounded off to fetch a chessboard, Alexander walked Jacob to the edge of the grand hallway. Portraits of Whitmores lined the walls, generations of wealth staring down in cold judgment. "You've crossed into a world you don't belong to," Alexander said quietly. "Tell me, Jacob, are you after something? Money? Favors?" Jacob's chin lifted. "I don't want anything from you. I want him to learn. He shouldn't grow up thinking the world is only numbers in a bank account." The word stung more than Alexander expected. Numbers in a bank account. That had been his father's gospel, drilled into him until love was measured in profits. For years, Alexander had repeated the same creed, until even Noah flinched at his lectures. For a flicker of a second, Alexander wondered if this boy wasn't a threat, but a mirror. And mirrors, he knew, revealed truths money couldn't silence. From somewhere deep inside, an old vow whispered back to him, "If anyone ever betrayed me again, I'd make them regret it." But for the first time, Alexander wondered if it wasn't betrayal he should fear, but redemption. The next morning, Alexander stood by the window of his private study, staring down at the gardens where Noah and Jacob once again sat cross-legged, bent over that battered notebook. His coffee had long gone cold, untouched. He pressed a button on the intercom. "David," he said, summoning his head of security. Minutes later, a tall man in a dark suit entered, his expression sharp. "Yes, sir." "I want a background check," Alexander said without turning. "On the boy. Jacob." Quietly. "I want to know everything." David nodded. "Understood." When the door shut, Alexander let out a breath. His empire had been built on information, on knowing everything about everyone in his path. He didn't trust what he couldn't control. And yet, as he watched Noah laughing freely, something Alexander rarely managed to inspire, he felt the ground beneath his certainty shift. Hours later, David returned, holding a thin folder. "Sir, there's not much. No school records. No guardian on file. Local shelter logs show he stayed off and on but never consistently. He's been surviving on his own for years. Parents, both deceased. Mother passed during childbirth complications, father killed in a warehouse fire when Jacob was 6. No extended family came forward." Alexander's fingers tightened around the folder. An orphan. Alone, drifting through the cracks of a world that ignored him. Images from his own childhood slammed into him, the cold nights after his father's bankruptcy, the sting of his mother's silence, the betrayal when relatives who once smiled at their wealth refused even a coin when ruin came. He had been forced to grow steel in his bones. He had chosen revenge as fuel. But this boy, Jacob, had chosen knowledge, teaching, purpose. Down in the garden, Noah clapped his hands as Jacob showed him how to use a stick and stones to play a numbers game. Alexander's son, who once sulked through expensive tutors, now lit up like a boy discovering treasure. "Dad!" Noah's voice rang out, spotting him at the window. "Jacob says if I practice every day, I'll be better than my whole class. Isn't that amazing?" Alexander forced a smile, though his chest felt heavy. "Yes, Noah. Amazing. Later, when the boys came inside, Alexander intercepted Jacob in the hallway. "You've been living without family," he said quietly. Jacob stiffened but didn't look away. "I don't need sympathy." "It's not sympathy I'm offering," Alexander replied, his voice sharper than he intended. "It's truth. And truth matters." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Jacob said, "Truth doesn't change where I sleep at night. Or who's waiting when I wake up." The words landed like stones. For years, Alexander had told himself betrayal hardened him for greatness. But this boy wasn't hardened. He was still soft enough to teach, still brave enough to give when the world had given him nothing. And suddenly, Alexander realized something dangerous. Jacob's very existence was a rebuke to the life he had built on vengeance. The Whitmore Library was a cathedral of knowledge, its towering shelves lined with first editions, rare manuscripts, and polished leather volumes. Alexander sat at the great oak desk, but the papers before him blurred. His mind wasn't on quarterly reports or international deals. It was on the boy sleeping in the guest wing, a boy who didn't belong in this marble palace, yet somehow fit better than many who had dined here in tailored suits. The door creaked. Noah padded in, clutching his chessboard. "Dad," he said softly, "Jacob beat me twice today. He said losing helps me think better." Alexander studied his son. For months, Noah had been restless, distracted, unimpressed by the toys money bought. Tutors complained he lacked focus. Yet now, under Jacob's guidance, he brimmed with energy. "You like him," Alexander observed. "He listens," Noah replied simply. "You're always busy." The word stung more than Noah could know. Busy, Alexander had once believed endless work was love, providing wealth as proof of care. But here was his son, carving joy out of the presence of a homeless boy. That night, Alexander poured himself a drink, staring into the amber liquid. Memories invaded, the partner who had betrayed him years ago, siphoning millions, forcing Alexander into the most brutal revenge he'd ever orchestrated. He'd crushed the man's career, exposed him in court, and watched with satisfaction as his rival's family fell into disgrace. Never forgive, never forget had become Alexander's creed. Mercy was weakness, vengeance was power. And yet Jacob's words returned, echoing like a challenge, understanding doesn't cost money. It costs time. The next day, Alexander found Jacob in the garden again, hunched over a math problem with Noah. "Why do you waste time teaching him?" Alexander asked, his tone harsher than intended. Jacob looked up calmly. "Because someone has to. Money doesn't raise a child. People do." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Careful. You speak as if you know me." "I don't need to know you," Jacob replied. "I just know what it feels like to be ignored." The honesty was disarming. Alexander had built walls so high that even Noah rarely scaled them. To hear those words from a boy with nothing, a boy with no reason to speak so boldly, cracked something inside him. "Do you hate the world for what it did to you?" Alexander asked suddenly. Jacob paused, then shook his head. "No. Hate takes too much energy. I'd rather use what little I have to learn. To help. To keep going." Alexander studied him, unsettled. Hate had fueled his empire. Revenge had kept him sharp. But this boy, this orphan, had chosen a different path, and somehow, that made him more dangerous than any rival Alexander had ever faced. For the first time, Alexander wondered, if he let Jacob stay, would he destroy the boy's innocence? Or would the boy destroy his carefully guarded bitterness? Jacob's footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors as the butler led him through the vast halls of the Whitmore mansion. For the first time in years, the house seemed alive with Noah's laughter trailing behind. Alexander watched from the landing above, arms folded, his expression unreadable. To the staff, Jacob was a disruption, a reminder of a world outside their carefully polished walls. Whispers trailed behind him, that he was unwashed, unworthy, a shadow at the table where dignitaries once dined. Alexander heard them, but he said nothing. Instead, he studied Noah. His son glowed with a happiness Alexander couldn't remember seeing before. That evening, in the drawing room, Noah coaxed Jacob into playing piano. The boy's fingers hovered uncertainly, but then he pressed a simple melody, halting but steady. Noah clapped along, laughing, urging him on. Alexander stood by the fireplace, a glass in hand, caught between irritation and awe. "You've never had lessons?" he asked. Jacob shook his head. "I listened outside music halls sometimes. Tried to copy the sounds later." Alexander exhaled slowly, memories pressing in. He remembered his first nights in wealth, after clawing back his family's fortune. He had stood in this very room, swearing he'd never allow anyone unworthy into his sanctuary. Wealth, he believed, was a fortress. But now here was a boy without a home, filling his house with a melody born of survival. After Jacob left the piano, Noah turned to his father. "He's amazing, isn't he? You see, Dad? He's more than just where he comes from." Alexander swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Where he comes from is the problem, Noah." Jacob's eyes flashed, but his voice stayed calm. "With respect, sir, where you come from doesn't decide where you'll end up. You of all people should know that." The room fell still. Alexander's grip tightened on his glass. The boy couldn't know, about the betrayals that had shaped him, the rival who had stolen millions, the partners he'd crushed without mercy, the revenge that had fueled his empire. But the words cut deep all the same. "Careful, Jacob," Alexander said finally, his tone edged. But Jacob didn't flinch. "You asked me once if I hate the world. I don't. But I won't bow to it either." Later that night, Alexander stood outside Noah's door, listening to his son whisper with Jacob as they pored over homework. For the first time, he felt like an intruder in his own house. The walls he had built to protect himself from betrayal were now closing in, and he wondered if bringing this boy closer would unravel everything. Still, he didn't send him away. And that choice, unspoken and unresolved, marked the beginning of a transformation Alexander couldn't yet control. The following week, Alexander hosted a dinner for 2 board members and their wives. The mansion glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished silver, a stage for wealth and power. Yet beneath the glow, tension simmered. Jacob lingered near the kitchen, helping Noah arrange books he'd brought to show his father's guests. His presence did not go unnoticed. "Alexander," one of the wives whispered, her jeweled fingers tightening around a wine glass. "Who is that boy? He's not one of yours, is he?" Before Alexander could respond, the butler stepped in. "He's an acquaintance of Master Noah's. Temporary." The word dripped with disdain. At the far end of the table, Noah's face flushed. "He's my friend," he said loudly, silencing the room. "And he's smarter than any of the tutors you bring here." The guests exchanged startled glances. Alexander forced a smile, but his chest burned. In their eyes, he saw the same scorn once cast on him when his family had fallen. The whispers in the corridors of prep school, the laughter at his worn shoes, the humiliation of being shut out from tables like this. Later, when the guests departed and the laughter faded, Alexander found Jacob in the hallway, his shoulders tense. "You shouldn't be here when I host business," Alexander said quietly. Jacob met his gaze. "I didn't ask to be here. Noah wanted me. But I won't apologize for existing." The words echoed. Years ago, Alexander had stood before creditors who sneered at his family's ruin. He'd clenched his fists and vowed revenge. "One day, I'll build a fortune so high, no one will ever laugh at me again." And he had kept that vow, crushing rivals, buying silence, wielding wealth like a blade. Now here was a boy, stripped of everything, yet standing with the same fire in his eyes. That night, as Alexander walked past the servants' quarters, he overheard two staff whispering. "It's disgraceful. Letting a street boy sit at the same table. What's next? Adoption? He's a threat. Imagine if he steals." Alexander froze, every muscle tightening. In his world, betrayal was never tolerated. Once, when a rival CEO spread rumors to damage his reputation, Alexander hadn't merely sued him, he had orchestrated a financial ruin so complete that the man vanished into obscurity. Brutal revenge was the language Alexander spoke fluently. And now, as he listened to his own staff mock Jacob, he felt the same cold fury ignite. Only this time, it wasn't his pride on the line. It was a boy who reminded him of everything he once was. When he entered his study, Noah was already there, arms folded. "If Jacob goes, I'll hate this house forever." Alexander's heart pounded. He had built this empire to command loyalty, but in his son's eyes, loyalty belonged to a boy with nothing. And for the first time in years, Alexander wasn't sure whose side he wanted to stand on. The Whitmore estate glowed under the soft hum of evening lights as Alexander entered the grand dining room once more. This time, the guests weren't board members or investors, but Noah's classmates and their parents, a gesture to show his softer side, orchestrated by his public relations team. It was meant to be simple, controlled. But nothing in Alexander's life ever remained simple. Jacob sat quietly at Noah's side, his hair neater, his clothes freshly laundered thanks to the housekeeper. Still, the contrast was stark, one boy born to billions, the other carved from hardship. The first whispers began almost immediately. "Isn't that the street boy?" one mother murmured, her pearls catching the light. "What is he doing here?" Another father smirked. "Whitmore's gone soft. Letting charity sit at the same table as legacy." Noah bristled, his hand tightening around Jacob's arm. "He belongs here. He's my friend." The table fell silent as all eyes turned to Alexander. This was the moment, the billionaire, the tycoon, the man who crushed rivals with a glance. Would he banish the boy to preserve his image, or allow the whispers to grow into scandal? Alexander's jaw clenched. He remembered standing outside country clubs as a teenager, barred because his father's bankruptcy had turned them into outcasts overnight. He remembered the sting of humiliation, the way laughter followed him like a curse. That memory burned now, sharpened by Jacob's quiet, unflinching gaze. "Noah's right," Alexander said finally, his voice calm but resonant. "Jacob belongs here." A collective gasp rippled across the table. The PR assistant nearly choked on her wine. The butler froze mid-step, eyes wide. "He is a guest in my home," Alexander continued, his gaze sweeping over the room. "And in this house, guests are treated with respect." One of the fathers scoffed. "He's no guest, Alexander. He's a stray." The word cut the air like a blade. Alexander set down his fork with deliberate precision, his voice dropping to steel. "Say that again, and you'll find yourself uninvited not only from my table, but from every boardroom in this city." Silence. The man paled, lips pressed shut. Around the table, no one dared move. Noah's eyes shone with pride, but it was Jacob who held Alexander's gaze the longest. He didn't smile, didn't thank him. He simply nodded once, the silent acknowledgement of a man who had earned respect, not borrowed it. That night, when the guests had left, Noah threw his arms around his father. "I knew you'd stand up for him, Dad. I knew it." Alexander stiffened, uncertain of what to do with such unfiltered joy. He glanced past his son to where Jacob lingered in the doorway. For years, Alexander had defined power as crushing enemies. But tonight, for the first time, power had meant something else, lifting someone who had no one else to defend him. And it terrified him more than any rival ever had. The library was silent, save for the faint scratching of chalk against slate. Jacob leaned over the desk, sketching equations while Noah scribbled alongside him, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth in concentration. Alexander lingered by the window, a newspaper forgotten in his hands. He had planned only to observe, but the longer he stood there, the more the rhythm of Jacob's voice drew him in. Numbers aren't just rules, Jacob explained, his tone patient. They're patterns. Like music. Once you hear the rhythm, it makes sense. Noah grinned. Like piano? Exactly, Jacob said, his eyes lighting. Every problem has its own melody. Alexander's brow furrowed. He'd never thought of numbers that way. For him, they had always been weapons, balance sheets to crush competitors, stock prices to outmaneuver rivals. Numbers had built his empire, but never once had he considered the music. Explain it to me, Alexander said suddenly. Both boys looked up. Noah's eyes widened in surprise. You want to learn? Alexander crossed the room slowly, his presence filling the space. Yes. Show me. Jacob's expression didn't change, but his voice remained steady as he slid the slate toward Alexander. Try this. Find the rhythm. For a moment, Alexander stared at the simple equation as if it were a challenge from a rival CEO. He picked up the chalk, his hand unusually heavy. Noah leaned closer, whispering, Dad, it's okay if you get it wrong. Alexander forced a faint smile. Wrong. That word had never been allowed in his vocabulary. He had built an empire on precision, on never faltering. And yet, as he scratched the answer and Jacob nodded approval, something in him loosened. You see, Jacob said softly. It's not about power. It's about understanding. The words sank deeper than Alexander expected. He flashed back to his younger years. Nights studying under dim lamps, his father barking that mistakes were weakness, that only domination mattered. He remembered clawing his way back after betrayal, forging revenge into profit, shaping his life around crushing others before they could crush him. But this boy, this orphan with nothing, was teaching him that strength wasn't always measured in victories. Sometimes, it was measured in patience. That night, Alexander walked Jacob to the guest room. At the door, he paused. You speak like someone twice your age. Jacob looked at him calmly. When life takes everything, you grow up fast. Alexander's throat tightened. He wanted to ask more, about the nights Jacob had spent in shelters, about the loneliness that clung to his voice, but instead, he said only, good night. As he turned away, the butler appeared in the hall, disapproval etched across his face. Sir, with respect, this is unwise. That boy doesn't belong here. He could destroy everything. Alexander's gaze turned icy. If anyone lays a hand on him, or tries to drive him out, they'll answer to me. The butler paled, nodding stiffly. Alexander walked on, realizing with a chill that he had spoken the truth. His empire had always been built on revenge. And now, if anyone threatened Jacob, he would unleash that same ruthless fire, not to protect wealth, but to protect a boy who reminded him of everything he once was. Storm clouds rolled over the Whitmore estate as if the sky itself sensed the unease within. Jacob had become a fixture in the household, but with every passing day, whispers grew louder. Staff muttered in corridors, tabloids hinted at scandal, and business partners questioned Alexander's judgment. The breaking point came when a glossy magazine splashed a photo of Noah and Jacob across its front page. The caption stung like venom, Whitmore heir tutored by street urchin, has the billionaire lost control? Alexander slammed the magazine onto his desk, the sound echoing through the study. His assistant flinched. Sir, the board is concerned. They believe this boy undermines the family image. They've suggested, removing him. Removing him? Alexander's voice was ice. Sir, it's just, perhaps placing him back in a shelter, discreetly. Enough. Alexander rose to his full height, the room trembling with his fury. When my father lost everything, those same board members turned their backs on us. I clawed my way up from humiliation while they laughed. And now they dare dictate who belongs under my roof. The assistant swallowed hard. I'm only relaying. Relay this, Alexander snapped, his eyes blazing. If anyone so much as breathes another word about Jacob, they will be finished. Not just dismissed, ruined. Later that evening, Jacob sat with Noah in the library, helping him with a reading exercise. His voice was steady, but Alexander noticed the boy's hands trembled as he turned the pages. You saw the papers, Alexander said quietly. Jacob nodded. I've seen worse. Worse? Jacob's gaze dropped. People shouting. Throwing things. Telling me I don't deserve to exist. He paused, then added, it doesn't matter. I'm used to it. The words pierced Alexander like shards of glass. Used to it. He remembered himself at Jacob's age, mocked by wealthy classmates, cast out after his father's ruin. He had vowed vengeance then, and tonight, the same fire returned, hotter, sharper, more dangerous. You're not used to it anymore, Alexander said, his voice low, almost a growl. Not while you're under my roof. Anyone who tries to hurt you, Jacob, anyone, will answer to me. Jacob's eyes flickered, uncertain whether to believe him. Noah, however, beamed with pride. See? I told you, Jacob. Dad always wins. Outside, thunder cracked, shaking the windows. It was as if the heavens themselves bore witness to a dangerous shift. Alexander Whitmore, the billionaire who once wielded revenge to protect only himself, was now sharpening that same blade for a boy who had nothing but dignity. And though he didn't yet realize it, this was no longer about reputation. It was about legacy. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and diamonds, the air heavy with the scent of roses and arrogance. It was a charity gala, an event Alexander had attended countless times, but tonight the whispers were sharper, aimed not at him but at the boy standing quietly at Noah's side. Jacob wore a borrowed suit, the sleeves slightly too long, but he carried himself with dignity. Noah clung proudly to his arm, ignoring the curious stares. Isn't that the street boy? A woman sneered behind her fan. Whitmore's lost his mind. He'll regret this, another man chuckled. The board won't tolerate a stray in the family circle. Alexander heard every word. His jaw tightened as he scanned the crowd, the same faces who had once mocked his family when they fell into ruin. He had clawed his way back with vengeance, crushing every rival, buying every silence. And now, those same mouths dared mock his son's friend. The host tapped a glass. Mr. Whitmore, would you care to say a few words? Alexander strode to the podium, his presence commanding instant silence. He let the pause stretch, his gaze sweeping the crowd until unease settled over them like a storm cloud. You whisper about him, Alexander said finally, his voice low but razor-sharp. You call him a stray. An embarrassment. But what you don't know, what none of you cared to ask, is his story. Gasps rippled through the room as he gestured toward Jacob. The boy froze, eyes wide, but Alexander's tone softened. Jacob is an orphan. His mother died giving him life. His father was lost in a fire when he was 6. No family stepped forward. No society programs saved him. He slept in shelters, on park benches, and still, he chose to learn. To teach. To give my son something money could never buy, understanding. A hush fell over the ballroom, heavy with shame. Some lowered their eyes, others shifted uncomfortably, their smugness dissolving. Alexander's voice hardened. You call him a stray. I call him a survivor. You say he doesn't belong here. Then none of you do, because he has shown more integrity, more strength, than half the men who sit on my board. One man coughed nervously. Alexander, surely. Surely what? Alexander snapped, eyes blazing. That I should bow to your gossip. That I should abandon a boy because it makes you uncomfortable. No. Not again. When my family lost everything, you mocked us. You turned away. But I survived. And now, I will not stand by while you do the same to him. The silence was absolute. Noah's eyes shone with tears, his pride spilling over. Jacob's face flushed, but his spine straightened. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. As Alexander stepped down, the crowd parted, their whispers replaced with stunned awe. In that moment, Alexander knew he hadn't just defended Jacob, he had declared war on a society that had once betrayed him. And this time, he would win not with wealth alone, but with truth. The morning after the gala, headlines blazed across newspapers and online feeds. Whitmore defends orphan at gala, society stunned. Billionaire declares street boy his son's teacher and friend. Some articles praised his compassion. Others sneered, calling it a publicity stunt. But none could ignore it. The world had heard Jacob's story, and Alexander had made it impossible to bury. In the boardroom, tension crackled like static. A group of directors sat stiffly, their faces tight with disapproval. One of them leaned forward. Alexander, this stunt has consequences. Investors are unsettled. We cannot tie the Whitmore legacy to. Finish that sentence, Alexander interrupted coldly, and you will no longer sit on this board. The man faltered. Alexander rose, slamming a folder onto the table. You forget who built this empire. You forget who clawed it back from ashes when you all whispered I was finished. I didn't bow then. I will not bow now. Jacob stays. My son learns from him. And if any of you doubt my judgment, consider your own seats already empty. Silence. Not one man dared challenge him further. That evening, Alexander walked the estate gardens with Noah and Jacob. The boys raced ahead, laughter spilling into the twilight. Alexander paused beneath the oak tree, the same place where he had first seen Jacob teaching Noah. He remembered the bitterness of his own childhood, the betrayal of so-called allies, the hunger that had driven him to vengeance. For years, he had believed wealth was the only answer. But tonight, watching the two boys, he saw something different. Legacy wasn't built only on power, but on the lives one touched. Jacob, Alexander called softly. The boy turned, wary but steady. I want you to understand something, Alexander said. You are no longer just a guest here. You're part of this family's future. That means protection. Education. A place that cannot be taken from you. Jacob blinked, his throat tightening. Why? Why me? Alexander's eyes softened, though his voice remained iron. Because I see myself in you. And because you've given my son something I never could, joy without fear. Noah beamed, grabbing Jacob's hand. See? I told you Dad means it. But Alexander wasn't finished. His tone sharpened as he added, and if anyone dares try to take that from you, the way people once tried to take everything from me, I will destroy them. The words weren't a threat. They were a vow, forged from decades of ruthless survival. The same man who had once orchestrated brutal revenge against rivals now stood ready to wield that power for Jacob's sake. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Alexander felt something he hadn't known in years, peace, edged with purpose. For the first time, his empire was no longer about control, or vengeance, or pride. It was about building a legacy strong enough to outlive whispers, wealth, and betrayal. And Jacob was now part of that legacy. I want you to understand something, Alexander said. You are no longer just a guest here. You're part of this family's future. That means protection. Education. A place that cannot be taken from you. Jacob blinked, his throat tightening. Education. Alexander nodded. The best schools. The kind no one thought you would ever enter. And when you walk into those halls, you won't be walking alone. You'll walk in with my name behind you. Jacob's chest rose and fell, caught between disbelief and gratitude. For years he had dreamed of sitting in a real classroom, of having pencils that weren't broken, of learning without being chased away. And now, the chance was real. The gates of St. Andrew's Academy loomed high and gilded, the kind of school where politicians and CEOs sent their heirs. Jacob stood at the threshold, clutching a brand new backpack, his palms sweating. Around him, polished cars dropped off children in pressed uniforms. He adjusted his tie, feeling the weight of every stare. Whispers trailed behind him. That's the boy Whitmore took in. They say he used to live on the streets. He doesn't belong here. Jacob kept walking, shoulders straight. He remembered Alexander's words, "You'll walk in with my name behind you." At first, the days were brutal. Some students mocked his accent, his old habits of scribbling in margins, his hesitation when navigating the gleaming halls. One boy even shoved him against a locker. "Street trash," the boy sneered. Jacob's fist tightened, but he remembered Alexander's warning, "Revenge is a blade, wield it wisely, or it cuts you too." Instead of striking back, Jacob poured his energy into study. Weeks later, the school hosted a math competition. The auditorium buzzed with parents and teachers. Jacob sat among polished competitors, the same boy who had mocked him smirking from across the stage. When the problems flashed on the screen, Jacob's eyes lit up. Numbers weren't just rules, they were music, rhythm, patterns. He solved each one with calm precision, his battered notebook now replaced with crisp paper but carrying the same fire. By the end, he stood at the top of the scoreboard. The room erupted, shock, applause, disbelief. Noah jumped to his feet, shouting, "That's my brother." Alexander's lips curved into the faintest smile, his eyes burning with pride. Reporters swarmed the story. From orphan to champion, the headlines read. Alexander seized the moment, standing before cameras. "This is what opportunity does," he declared. Jacob was cast aside by a system that should have protected him. "I won't let that happen again." From this day forward, the Whitmore Foundation will fund scholarships for orphans across this country. No child should be defined by loss, but by potential. The announcement sent shockwaves through society. The same voices that once mocked now clamored to praise. Yet Alexander wasn't doing it for them. He was doing it for Jacob, and for the boy he himself had once been, humiliated and abandoned. That night, Jacob sat under the oak tree with Noah, the moonlight casting silver over their faces. Alexander joined them, lowering himself onto the grass. For once, there were no walls between them. "You've changed me, Jacob," Alexander said quietly. "Once, I lived only for revenge. Now I live for legacy. And you are part of it." Jacob swallowed hard, fighting tears. "Thank you, Dad." The word hung in the night air, fragile but unbreakable. Alexander's chest tightened, but he didn't look away. For the first time, he felt whole. And fate, irony, and karma had finally aligned, turning what began as ridicule into redemption, and what began as a homeless orphan into the heart of a billionaire's empire. The iron gates of St. Andrew's Academy swung open, and Jacob stepped inside, his uniform stiff and unfamiliar. Around him, sleek cars dropped off students with chauffeurs and polished shoes. He clutched his new backpack, its straps still creaking, and forced his shoulders straight. But the whispers came immediately. "That's the orphan Whitmore picked up. He doesn't belong here. Bet he doesn't last a week." Jacob ignored them, eyes fixed ahead. He remembered Alexander's words, "Walk in with my name behind you." The classrooms were pristine, walls lined with digital boards and books that smelled new. Jacob's fingers twitched. For years, his notebooks had been scraps scavenged from bins. Now he sat at a desk that gleamed, holding pencils sharpened to perfection. But the stares burned. Teachers introduced him stiffly, some students sneered openly. At lunch, no one sat beside him. Noah tried, but other boys whispered, "He's only here because your dad bought him in." That night, Jacob sat alone in his dorm room, staring at the glowing city beyond the window. For a moment, doubt gnawed at him. Maybe he didn't belong. Maybe this was all a mistake. Then he remembered the nights in shelters, the lessons he taught himself under street lamps, the way Noah had looked at him with trust. He whispered to himself, "I belong anywhere I decide to." The next day, a boy shoved him against a locker. "Street trash," the boy spat. Jacob's fists clenched. Rage burned, but Alexander's warning echoed, "Revenge is a blade. Wield it wisely." Instead of swinging, Jacob met the boy's eyes and said calmly, "You'll see me at the top of the class." Word spread. The orphan challenge, they called it, mockery at first. But Jacob embraced it. He studied until midnight, filling pages with equations, devouring textbooks, asking teachers questions others wouldn't dare. And slowly, whispers began to shift. One teacher remarked, "The boy has brilliance." Another admitted, "His focus puts the others to shame." But ridicule didn't vanish. It only simmered, waiting for the right moment to either crush Jacob or prove him. And that moment was coming. The auditorium at St. Andrew's buzzed with anticipation. Rows of polished chairs held parents, teachers, and students, all gathered for the annual academic decathlon, the crown jewel of the school year. For decades, only the wealthiest, most tutored students had stood on that stage. Tonight, Jacob's name was among them. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "The orphan boy. This will be embarrassing. He won't last a single round. Whitmore's pet project is about to crash." Alexander sat near the front, his sharp suit gleaming under the lights. He leaned back, unreadable, but inside, tension knotted his chest. Beside him, Noah fidgeted with excitement, whispering, "He's going to win, Dad. You'll see." The competition began. Questions fired one after another, history, science, mathematics. Jacob stood calm at the podium, his eyes steady. When others stumbled, he answered with clarity. When they hesitated, he spoke with quiet confidence. By the halfway mark, murmurs filled the crowd. The street boy wasn't failing, he was leading. One teacher leaned toward another. "He studies like his life depends on it." "It does," the other replied softly. Then came the final round, advanced mathematics. The problem flashed on the screen, long and tangled. Competitors froze. Even the brightest hesitated. Jacob's pencil danced across his paper, his lips moving as if he were hearing a melody only he understood. He lifted his hand first, submitting his answer. The judges conferred, then announced, "Correct." Gasps erupted. Applause followed. The scoreboard flickered. Jacob, first place. The auditorium erupted. Some clapped grudgingly, others in awe. But Noah leapt to his feet, shouting, "That's my brother." His voice cracked with pride, carrying across the hall. Alexander rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Jacob. For years, his victories had been in boardrooms, where revenge and profit ruled. But this triumph of a boy who had once been invisible, felt larger than any empire he'd built. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed. Flashbulbs burst as they pushed microphones forward. "Mr. Whitmore, what does this mean for your family? For your legacy?" Alexander placed a hand firmly on Jacob's shoulder. "It means the future isn't written by wealth alone. It's written by resilience. This boy is proof. And from today, I am expanding the Whitmore Foundation. Every orphan, every forgotten child who dreams of learning, will have a place at a desk. No more wasted brilliance." The announcement sent ripples through the media. Some hailed him as a visionary, others called it madness. But in that moment, Alexander didn't care. As the cameras flashed, Jacob glanced up at him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Jacob didn't see just a billionaire. He saw a man who had chosen him, defended him, and now, believed in him. And Alexander, the man who had once lived for vengeance, finally saw legacy in its purest form. The Whitmore estate glowed under the soft light of dusk, the gardens alive with fireflies. Alexander sat beneath the oak tree, the same spot where it had all begun, where he had first seen a ragged boy teaching his son from a battered notebook. Now, that boy wore a crisp uniform, medals from school competitions glinting faintly in the fading light. Jacob sat beside Noah, the two of them laughing over a chessboard. Their bond was unshakable, brothers not by blood, but by choice. Alexander watched them, a glass of water in his hand instead of the scotch he once used to numb the emptiness. For years, he had lived for revenge, wielding it like a weapon, building walls higher than his wealth. But those walls had crumbled the moment a homeless boy dared to sit under his tree. "Dad?" Noah called, his voice light. "Come play." Alexander chuckled softly, setting his glass aside. He lowered himself onto the grass, the expensive fabric of his trousers brushing against the dirt. Jacob shifted, as if uncertain whether to stay. "You don't have to keep calling me sir," Alexander said quietly, his eyes fixed on the board. "Not anymore." Jacob blinked, startled. "What should I call you then?" Alexander's gaze softened, his voice breaking through years of iron. "Call me what you need." The silence stretched, filled with the chorus of crickets. Jacob's throat tightened. He looked at Noah, who nodded with a grin, urging him on. Slowly, the word escaped, trembling but certain. "Dad." The sound pierced Alexander deeper than any deal, any revenge, any triumph ever had. His chest tightened, his eyes stung, but he didn't look away. He reached out, resting a steady hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You're my son now," Alexander said firmly. "Not because of pity, not because of circumstance, but because you've earned a place here. You've given me and Noah something money never could. Family." Tears welled in Jacob's eyes, but his smile was steady. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He belonged. The weeks that followed cemented the change. The Whitmore Foundation opened its doors, funding scholarships for orphans across the country. Schools once closed to children like Jacob now welcomed them with desks and books, their paths forever altered. Society that had once mocked whispered instead in awe. But for Alexander, none of that mattered more than nights like this, sitting on the grass with Noah and Jacob, laughter echoing through the estate, the ghosts of betrayal finally laid to rest. For years, his empire had been built on vengeance. Now, it was built on love, on purpose, on legacy. And fate, cruel, ironic, merciless fate, had delivered its most shocking twist of all. The billionaire who once trusted no one had been saved, not by money, not by power, but by an orphan boy with nothing but resilience in his hands.